When you hear the word God, or if you try to imagine what God looks like, what do you see in your imagination? Do you see a white haired man in a white robe? Do you imagine a universal energy field? Or maybe there is nothing when you think of God. But here's the thing: how can an infinite being like God even take on the substance of a thought? In other words, how can humans even begin to form an image in their mind of what God looks like? Does God even have a form? Or can we say in a very real way that God is made of a substance? When God thinks, is there a brain that thoughts are firing in? What is God? When the ancient Israelites created their tabernacle, remember when Moses was leading them out of Egypt, God commanded them to erect a tabernacle, a tent, where the priests were to meet with him. And they placed in the heart of this thing the Ark of the Covenant, and it was behind a big, huge curtain in the Holy of Holies. But you know what they didn't do? Unlike all the ancient pagan neighbors they had among them, they didn't create an image. They didn't take a piece of wood or stone and craft some kind of image and set it up in the Holy of Holies. No, no, no. God told them, do not craft an image. I myself, my glory, will manifest in that place. And why was God adamant about them not making some kind of idol to represent him? This is because God doesn't have a form, and he can't be represented in a three-dimensional object. To even attempt to diminish God or relegate him and his holiness to an object made of the stuff of our universe is blasphemous. But does this mean that God isn't made of something? As theologians over the centuries have tried to make sense out of the nature of God's being, they quite naturally had to ask, what is this being composed of? If you could analyze just one drop of God's being in a lab, what would you discover? Would that drop be the substance of space, as panentheists claim? Would it be composed of elements similar to what we see in our periodic table? Or is it something totally separate from our reality? You see, the Christian God, according to tradition, is uncreated spirit, which is a heavenly commodity, completely different from matter. Or is it? All right, that's what we're going to talk about. Traditionally, theologians and philosophers have made a point to keep them in separate categories. But the more we learn about the nature of matter and the nature of reality, maybe we need to rethink some of these ideas. And we'll get to that in a second. But spirit can exist in our universe, but it goes undetected, like certain frequencies of light. To say that God is spirit usually means that God is simple, uncompounded, and incorporeal. To say that God is simple is to say that God can't be analyzed or broken down into parts or different substances. So to think of studying a drop of God's being is futile. Spirit is an elusive something that humans simply can't analyze and study in a lab. But since God exists, God must take on some form or substance. Jesus said in the famous Sermon on the Mount that the pure in heart will see God. But what exactly will they see if God has no form or substance? To say that God is immaterial is not to say that God is nothing. It's impossible to actually be nothing in the true sense of the word and be God, because God is the opposite of nothing. God is everything. Anything that exists has properties of some sort, and it's no different with God. If God exists, then there has to be a way to say that God is here or there rather than nowhere, because a being of any kind can't be nothing. So we need to be careful that we don't just take the lazy approach and say God is immaterial and incorporeal and has no form or substance. We must also be careful that we don't allow science or philosophy to put words in God's mouth by making the Bible say something it doesn't actually say. Now, God in his fullness cannot be understood or seen by finite creatures. So he manifests his presence in a way we can comprehend. They are called Theophanies, and they are God's way of appearing in our physical realm so humans can see him and interact with him in this realm. This is what manifestations of the glory were in the Bible. The glory is a physical, tangible manifestation of the invisible God. And we're going to talk a lot about the glory in subsequent videos. And I've actually made some in the past, so you can look those up. But to see God as he really is, in the fullness of his glory, or whatever form he has for all eternity, it would destroy us. It would be like the Indiana Jones movie, where the bad guys exploded after their minds were overloaded with information by looking into the eyes of the aliens. The beauty and majesty of God is like that. It would destroy us because our human minds just cannot take all of that in at once. So God either manifests as an orb of bright light, and if you've ever seen the Spider-Man movie, the first one that came out, that had that little miniature sun, it's kind of like that. That was what would manifest above the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. So God would manifest as this little orb of light, kind of like a miniature sun, or he manifests as the figure of a man with light and fire coming out of him. But to say that this is God's essence now listen carefully. To say that God is the glory or that he is fire or light would be putting an infinite God into a finite form, and that is idolatry. See, God is not made of matter or energy or any properties found in our universe. Now, when God enters our universe, yes, light manifests, but that's for a different reason, and we're going to talk about that. So, if the glorious light of God is not God's essence, then what is? The best place to get some help with this would be Jesus. You would agree, right, that when Jesus says, God is, that you want to be paying attention to how he follows that word is, because Jesus knows what he's talking about. And Jesus said, God is spirit. That's the word that followed is. What is God? Spirit. And the Greek text does not say God is a spirit. The Greek actually says pneuma ha theos. The word spirit is first, emphasizing the fact that God is spirit. So Jesus is making a powerful statement about God's being. But let's look at the context in which this word was used so we know how to come up with a meaning. So let's start in John chapter 4, verse 20. The woman said, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. Now, pay attention to what Jesus says here. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. That's John 4, verses 20 through 24. Consider that Jesus was not having a deep philosophical discussion about metaphysics. He was talking to a despised woman in that culture. So Jesus wasn't trying to be deep and theological here. This is as basic as it gets when it comes to understanding God. Jesus was basically saying that God, because he is spirit, is not in any one location. He doesn't have locality, as we would say it in English. But how can we explain the Theophanies in the Bible where God did have locality? And how could we ever see God in the future if we can't say God is here versus there? Well, that gets back to the fact that just because God is spirit, that does not necessarily mean he can't take on some kind of form or appear to his creatures or localize. God's nature or being does not limit him in any way, so he can manifest his presence any way he so chooses. Now, the word spirit is hard to define. Even in the Hebrew culture, it can mean wind, breath, or the invisible, immaterial part of man. Each culture has its own idea of what spirit is, and unfortunately, because of the King James Version of the Bible that uses the word ghost, people in the West have wrong ideas of what a spirit is. When we think of a ghost, we think of some immaterial vapor or energy or maybe a white vaporous cloud. This isn't so strange because even Jesus made a distinction between spirits and physical beings. After he rose from the dead, Jesus tried to reassure his disciples that they were not seeing a ghost or a spirit. And here is the account from the book of Luke. This is Luke 24, verses 37 through 39. It says, they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Now, traditionally, as I just said, theologians have been careful to keep matter and spirit in very distinct categories, and have always been considered two very different realities. And part of this comes from this scene right here, where Jesus materializes in a room locked from the inside. And then he had to calm his disciples down and say, "No, no, I'm not a ghost. Look, I have flesh and bones." So it seems that Jesus is setting up a dualism between physical matter and spirit by saying, "Touch me, see, use your physical senses. If I was just a ghost, you wouldn't be able to use your physical senses." We can only conclude two things from this passage. First, Jesus did not say spirit beings have no form or body. He just told them that spirit isn't composed of the material elements that humans can see and touch. Flesh, or what we call the physical body, is made up of certain elements found on this planet. Spirit beings, on the other hand, are not from this world, and therefore they do not have bodies composed of earth elements. But this is not the same thing as saying spirits have no form, or they're not made of something. It is also very significant that Jesus presented to the disciples a physical body, made of the same earth elements our bodies are made of. Yet somehow Jesus was able to appear in the room even though it was locked. So while Jesus was presenting his physical body as evidence that he wasn't a ghost, his disciples had to be wondering how it is that his physical body they were now looking at and touching moved through solid walls to materialize right in front of them, because that is exactly what ghosts do. And he just told them that he's not a ghost, but yet he's behaving like a ghost. So what's going on here? Well, this is where science can maybe help us, because we have learned a lot about the nature of reality. We've learned a lot about matter and energy. We're starting to see that matter is really not all that different from spirit. Now, it is a completely different entity with different properties, but yet it behaves similarly at the quantum level. And we're going to talk about that. Now, if we're truly going to put an uncrossable chasm between spirit and matter, then we should at least understand matter. Now, we're never going to understand spirit, at least this side of glory, but we can at least try to understand matter. And that's what physicists are doing all the time, and we've come a long way. The concept of solidity and immateriality that philosophers in the past had to wrestle with were developed with a limited understanding of the basic properties of the cosmos. We still don't even know what we're made of, but we have come a long way since Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas or any of the other philosophers that developed doctrines about God's spiritual being. For example, we experience solidity. So when philosophers in the past made distinctions between matter and spirit, they assumed things about matter that are being corrected by newer scientific discoveries. It was assumed, based on observation, that matter is solid. If you're driving and hit another vehicle, you will have car damage because the matter of your car will interact with the matter of another car. But did you know that the atoms of your car don't really ever touch the atoms of the other car? In fact, you never really touch anything. And the illusion of touching and solidity is brought about by invisible forces we don't fully understand. Matter, which is made up of atoms and their smaller constituents, is defined as physical or corporeal substance in general, whether solid, liquid, or gaseous, especially as distinguished from incorporeal substance as spirit or mind, or from qualities, actions, and the like, something that occupies space. So matter can even be invisible like the air we breathe. In fact, all of the matter we can see is made up of smaller bits of matter we cannot see. And the Bible told us this thousands of years ago. The writer of Hebrews wrote, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." Albert Einstein discovered that matter and energy are different manifestations of the same thing, as revealed in his famous equation E equals mc squared. Well, that's all fine and good, but what is the thing that is manifesting in these different forms that we call matter and energy? Max Planck, considered by many the father of quantum mechanics, he may shed some light on this question. And here's what he said: all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force, which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of conscious and intelligent mind. We don't fully understand what matter and energy are, but matter is localized energy, and energy is information from the mind of God to perform some operation in this universe. Energy is spirit information doing something. Okay, so let's do a deep dive into what matter actually is. And in order to do this, we're going to have to look at atoms. We've all seen diagrams of atoms with the protons and neutrons in the center called a nucleus, and the electrons orbit the nucleus like planets orbiting the sun. Well, that's an old idea. Scientists now believe electrons exist as waves in a mist or fuzzy cloud rather than point-like pieces. Now, let's talk about the size of atoms. You want to talk about the genius mind of God. Just wrap your mind around how small atoms are. If it were possible to shrink to the size of an atom, you would have to shrink to 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. I know this number means nothing to most people, so let me give you some mental pictures to help you grasp it. Imagine an apple expanding to the size of the earth. The atoms that make up the apple start to grow and expand, which makes the apple grow. So to keep everything to scale, if the apple were to grow to the size of the earth, the atoms themselves would grow to the size of a real apple. Now imagine, as this earth-sized apple shrinks, the trillions of atoms that are the size of apples, they have to shrink back to their original size. I don't know how many apples it would take to make a ball in the sky the size of the earth, but it's hard to imagine that many apples shrinking enough to fill the space of just one apple. Going even further, atoms are so tiny that 1 million of them lined up side by side would equal the thickness of a piece of paper. One speck of dust, just one speck, contains 3 trillion atoms. It's almost too hard to believe that scientists even know about atoms or can measure their mass and size considering their extremely small sizes. It's quite miraculous that something as little as an atom can maintain properties like spin and charge and motion. Think about the electron, for example. It spins on an axis, kind of like our planet spins on an axis, giving us night and day. As electrons zig and zag around the nucleus, they do so at close to the speed of light. I challenge any scientist to create something as small as an electron, make it spin around an axis, and then keep it moving at close to the speed of light. And then, if you can create one electron, try to make trillions more, all spinning and moving at incredibly fast speeds, and then maintain that for billions of years. If you can do that, I'll come and worship at your feet, because only God can do that. Now here's where things get really interesting, because particles are actually ghost-like. See, as small as atoms are, they're essentially empty space. If you could blow up an atom to the size of the Earth, the nucleus would be a basketball in the center of the planet, with the electrons way out in the atmosphere, and everything in between would be empty. As Gerald Schroeder stated, if we could scale the center of an atom, the nucleus, up to 4 inches, the surrounding electron cloud would extend to 4 miles away, and essentially all the breach between would be marvelously empty. The solidity of iron is actually 99.99999% startlingly vacuous space made to feel solid by ethereal fields of force having no material reality at all. I know that's a mouthful, but what he's basically saying is that iron skillet that you think is so heavy is actually empty. It's actually 99.999% vacuous space. And the reason it feels solid is because of these ethereal fields of force that have no material reality. Think about that. Now think about this. This is amazing. According to Brian Greene, If the Empire State Building could be shrunk to eliminate all the free space between the atoms and all of the free space within the atoms themselves, it would be the size of a grain of rice. That's right, the Empire State Building being the size of a grain of rice. So when we think of something being solid, we must realize that there is no such thing. Solidity is an illusion brought on by invisible forces at the atomic level. Like charges repel, as anyone knows who has ever tried to make two like ends of a magnet touch. The repulsion of those charges is what gives us the impression something is solid. If you stop to think about it, our reality, or what some call the matrix, is made up of spirit-like particles carrying forces we don't even understand. So maybe it isn't so simple to just say God is spirit, so therefore he is immaterial. The more we understand matter, the more it appears to be immaterial. It is also assumed that solid objects can't move through solid objects. This is also based on the idea of spirit being completely different from matter. The thinking was ghosts or spirits can move through walls since they are invisible and immaterial. Now, if you try to walk through a wall, you're going to break your nose. But how did Jesus, who was in a physical body, appear in a room that was locked? And you say, well, he was God. Well, yes, he was. But watch. Before the discovery of quantum tunneling, religious critics scoffed at a story like this because the thought of a human being made of solid matter moving through solid walls like a ghost is impossible. However, experiments performed over the last century prove that matter can actually dematerialize to move through solid objects. If this were not true, two protons in the nucleus of an atom would never fuse together in the core of stars. Because particles can tunnel through solid barriers, two protons with the same charge can tunnel through the same field of repulsion that normally keeps them apart. You know, one would expect that if a tennis ball is thrown at a concrete wall, that the ball will never be able to penetrate it unless you are strong like Superman and can throw it hard enough. But in the quantum realm, elementary particles do not follow the rules of classical physics. As an illustration, consider Raymond Chow, who used two photons of light and placed a barrier in the pathway of only one photon. Both photons left at the same time, and both photons traveled at the speed of light. But Chow discovered that the photons that were directed toward the wall actually arrived on the other side of the wall before the photons that had no barrier. How does a photon of light travel faster than light? Well, as it turns out, the particle does not actually travel through the wall. The particle dematerializes and then rematerializes on the other side of the wall. This is perhaps how Jesus materialized right before his disciples' eyes, even though they were behind locked doors. Now, I don't know if this is bringing any clarity at all, but at least I hope it's making you think about matter versus spirit. Yes, they are distinct, but the more we learn about science and the nature of reality, the more we see that matter and spirit are not really all that different. You know, it is interesting to talk about, we're never going to fully understand this side of glory, but the Bible does say that God is spirit. And what we know from that is this: we can't see him, we can't feel him, but we can know him. Now, we know that God can manifest in some way, actually any way he wants. We don't know what form God has. We don't even really know what spirit is. If we did understand all of this stuff, then God wouldn't be God. But it's fun and it's interesting to pursue these things and think about these things and study them. And like I've said before, there is nothing higher or greater than studying God. God is spirit, and you must worship him in spirit. Now, we're going to talk about what all of that means in later videos, but that means that you don't have to go to a particular place, a particular building. You can worship God anywhere. You can worship God in your car. You can worship God walking around in nature. Yes, you should go to church. I'm not talking about not going to church. You should go to church, but you can worship God outside of the church. And that was the point of what Jesus was saying. God is spirit. God is everywhere. You can worship him anywhere. And because God is spirit, you should develop a lifestyle of worship anywhere you go. Talk to God. He's everywhere because he is spirit. And that's what I want you to take from this. What God is made of is not really that important. How close you are to Him and your relationship to Him is what matters. All of these questions are going to be answered when we see Him in glory. But for now, all we can do is just think about these things, talk about them, and try to grope around in the dark trying to understand our Creator. So with that, we will bring this to a close, and I will see you in the next video. God bless.